One moment, just waiting for the live feed to go through. And there we go. Okay, well, welcome everybody to our conversation today, or community dialogue, to use the language that we've been trying to use, called Addressing Racism in the Queer Community. This is part of the New Haven Pride Center's Week of Action, where we are reminding ourselves that Pride started as a protest, and in that means taking action during Pride Month, and hopefully taking that action throughout the year and in doing it year round, particularly because many of the things that we're talking about during this week are not things that are going to be addressed by a single conversation or a single action. I'm super excited to bring to today's discussion an incredible group of folks who I like to call experts. They are going to give us their thoughts and perspectives, and this is really going to be an open dialogue where if you are in the audience and you'd like to participate with a question or would like to kind of use the raise your hand function and let me know, I can unmute you so you can also comment and participate with our incredible speakers today. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves, and I'm also going to stop talking and take up space. And I'm just going to go in the order that you appear on my screen. So Roslyn, it looks like you get to go first.
That's too much pressure. I can't do that. Good morning, good afternoon, whatever time it is. I'm Roslyn Sotero. Roslyn is just fine. Pronouns are she, her, hers. And when Patrick reached out to have me be a part of this panel, I had to ask him, how do you want me to open up? Because what is this prompt that I can start framing my thoughts around so that I can be a little bit more intentional? And I'm just gonna read the prompt that he gave me because it was actually extremely helpful. He asked me, when you think of racism in the queer community, what is your response? What triggers does it bring up to the surface? And I thought that was really helpful. And so I'm just speaking from that and to that question. The first few things that I think of when it comes to this conversation around racism in the queer community is two things: erasure and anti-Blackness. Those are the two things that immediately shoot up for me. I think about the ways in which Black and brown stories, realities, narratives, cultures, aesthetics, labor has been completely erased from the mainstream dialogue, and if not worse, co-opted by like white middle-class cisgender gays. Like, that's a thing. I think about the ways that white-led queer organizations are equating so often homophobia and anti-Black racism as if they want to perform this idea of relatability or solidarity, when really it's just avoiding accountability in this fight against racism and white supremacy as a larger concept, and not even looking at those concepts as a way that inform one another to address the white supremacy that is making it possible. And I think also, as a Puerto Rican woman, I think also about the ways in which my non-Black Latinx folks like to toe the line and play games and play both sides, where it's like, I want to align with whiteness because there's perks with it, but I also want to act as if I'm in solidarity with folks who might be physically closer to me or even culturally closer to me. You can't do both. And I think I can start the conversation there by saying you cannot align yourself with whiteness and then play that you're in solidarity with Black folks. It's a period, non-negotiable. I have some other thoughts that I would say, and I know that Patrick was going to give like 3 or 5 minutes for folks, but I would actually like to pass it on to other folks to see what they have to say. But I'll leave it there for the moment.
Thank you so much, Roslyn. And Bilal, we're going to go to you next.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Bilal Tajldeen, pronouns are he, him, his. Some similar thought process to what Roslyn was saying about, how do we ground our opening response to this question within context, right? So I'm gonna just say a couple things purely from my perspective and my own lived experience. As someone who's Lebanese, the Lebanese people are classified as white, which is, I think, an important acknowledgement. Lebanese culture is really closely related to French culture by process of colonization, where the French was the ruling class over Lebanon for a long time. And still to this day, when you go to Lebanon, you're any chance of hearing English, French, or Arabic. But the closer you are to the cities, i.e. tourist destinations, places that are looking more attractive to European vacationers, you're more likely to hear French than anything else. They won't speak English, they won't speak Arabic, they'll just speak to you in French. And so when I think about racism in the queer community and I think about my place in it, that becomes part of my backdrop, right? That there's a sort of a pre-9/11 way to be Arab and a post-9/11 way to be Arab. And a lot of that has to do with distancing. A lot of my family and relatives and a lot of Lebanese people I know will more closely align themselves with being white and being Parisian rather than being Arab. And it's sort of like to Roslyn's point, right? Like you can't be for anti-Blackness and then align yourself with whiteness culturally and in terms of your own interests. And so I guess I see a lot of the racism in the queer community from where I sit around a fear of both the East, right? Like this really vague concept, and also a lot of really strong Islamophobia, right? Where you say you're Arab and then they assume that you're Muslim and they assume sort of all these really strong post 9/11 fears of religion and oppression, which is obviously, I mean, not true, right? We don't have to go into the ways in which that's not true right now. And my own, I guess, personal struggle is that where do you align yourself on that spectrum? Where do I align myself on that spectrum, knowing that there's a classification of whiteness behind me, but then in this sort of post 9/11 fear of the Arab lands, fear of the Middle East, the oppression can look similar, right? When you look at the midnight raids, like in New York City post 9/11, right? Where whole families were taken up and never heard from again. It's a weird place to be in this moment in time, purely from where I sit. And I'll stop. I don't know if that was 3 minutes or 5 minutes, but I'll stop rambling.
You're rambling, Bilal. Thank you, Bilal. And next we're going to go to Jesus.
Thanks, Patrick. So my name is Jesus Morales Sanchez. I use he, him, his pronouns. And I'm proudly an immigrant who lives in New Haven. I'm originally from Mexico. And I gotta say, when Patrick asked me to join the panel, I thought a lot about like really what it meant to be a person of color, what it meant to be a queer person, and also how do those interact? And I was like thinking a lot about like intersectionality and how does that affect me, and like how do I perpetrate those thoughts? So thank you, Roslyn, for saying what you said, because honestly, like that train of thought was, I think it's very, very spot on. And it boils down for me to two words: fetishization. Oh my God, being fetishized, basically, or being excluded. And a lot of time, just thinking about previous experiences, it's been being called exotic, being sought after, being pursued because I am, quote unquote, have the spice in me. But at the same time, being in a community that does not want anything to do with the rest of my identities. And I mean this as my awakening call was in 2013 to 2015-ish. We know that around those times, Prop 8 and DOMA went before the Supreme Court, and like gay marriage became legalized, and yay, that was a huge, huge victory, right? All the queer community was out there celebrating, and we were like really happy that gay marriage was happening, right? And then in 2015, the White House actually had an event for Pride Month. And there was a protester that started yelling at President Obama as he was giving a speech, asking him, President Obama, will you release trans people detained in immigration centers? She was called a heckler. She was called she was told that she was a guest, and that guests should not, treat someone like that when they're being invited to these kind of events. And eventually, she was kicked out of the White House. And I saw in the comments, yes, that's Jenny said Gutierrez, and I think that was kind of like the wake up call. That was like, okay, so we had a room full of progressive, quote unquote, progressive queers celebrating Pride, celebrating the victories of the LGBTQ community. And then we have a trans woman of color asking questions, trying to hold someone accountable for harm that is being happening to our communities. And instead they're cheering because she's getting kicked out of that space. And it's like, there is something fundamentally wrong in that scene. There is something that is very, very wrong about the way that queer culture is enabling whiteness and is rejecting basically anything that does not allow with whiteness, unless it can be seen as exotic or be fetishized. And I think that that's basically, I mean, I'm not gonna ramble for too long, but that's kind of like the intro and what I was like thinking as I was like preparing for this panel. So I'm sure that we're gonna be touching upon a lot of those points in the next, I don't know, hour and a half. I don't know how long we said that this is gonna last, but yeah.
Thank you, Jesus. Kamora, we're gonna go to you next.
Okay, so good afternoon, beautiful humans. I'm incredibly excited about this conversation, and I'm happy that it's going to last for about an hour and a half. And that's the beginning, like that's enough to just start stepping into this, because, you know, what, like that prompt of, you know, what does it bring up for you? It brings up a whole lot, but I'd have to say that just that overarching theme is missed opportunities and ignorance. And that's what I think of when I think of racism in the LGBTQ plus community. So I think about going back, so 2014, there was a black lesbian actually, who was kind of tired of being in spaces where white gay men felt that they could appropriate her culture and meet her with this. So she wrote an article basically saying, "Dear white gays, stop stealing black female culture." And white gay men were so incensed and so upset about this that they went out of their way to explain to her that her way of being black was wrong, and that her way of explaining to them, "Please stop pretending that you're me," was wrong. And it went to that place of, and that right there, I think there's all of these amazing places where education can happen. But I've been in white queer space. And when I say white queer space, I mean, even if most of the people in that space are melanated, there's an understanding that there's a white queer world that dominates the conversation. And so when we bring up these issues, we all hear, well, we're all oppressed. And so since we're all oppressed, then we all understand this. And I think of very, very, very real missed opportunities where we could grow together as this LGBTQ plus community that we say that we are, and actually move forward and do great things. I think of things like pride, and I understand that if you come from a privileged class and your experiences with the police is that they really do keep you safe, then you would feel as if there's a piece of liberation for the police to come around and try to keep you safe as you're having your pride parade. But that is so tone deaf when we think about who we are as melanated people. I mean, you know, we can get to what the police have done to the queer community as well. But as a black woman, the police don't make me safe. And when I'm walking into queer space that has a different idea, I'm allowed to either be the angry black woman who we're going to completely discount, or folks are going to try to get me to understand their way of being who they are. So I've formed this organization, this group, that says that we are Black and queer and Afrocentric. And yesterday you saw what that is. And I know that a lot of people have ideas on what that is, but BA Undivided, which is a group of young Black queer folks who show up as young Black queer folks all the time. And they're the folks who organized last Friday for Juneteenth. There was that huge march that had thousands of people. That was Juneteenth, clearly Black, that was supporting Black Lives Matter. Thousands of folks came. Yesterday, they did the exact same thing, but it was queer focused. They had hundreds of people. They had a much smaller group. And then there's that wonderful conversation of, yeah, this is the hard part, that intersection of Black and gay. There's a lot of gay folks who can scream and show up for diversity issues, showing up for Black issues, and understanding that America was built on anti-Blackness. The number of queer people who will not show up for Black specific issues is incredibly telling.
Thank you, Kamora. Caroline, we're gonna go to you next.
Wonderful. Hi, everyone. My name is Caroline. I use she, her pronouns, and identify as queer, and I'm Asian American and I'm biracial. So my mom's Korean and my dad's white. And I'm really, really honored to be here. I've actually never in my life been on a panel to talk about my queerness before. So this is really exciting for me. And I just hope to learn a lot from this conversation, ask a lot of questions of my fellow panelists. So when Patrick first invited me, I honestly wasn't sure if I was a fit. because I didn't feel like I actually had any experiences being a part of queer communities. But it was actually, I think, this resistance in myself that pushed me to be a part of the panel, because it made me ask myself the question and reflect on the question of why haven't I been a part of queer communities before? And Patrick's prompt to me was specifically to really speak to the Asian American experience, because it can often be left out. And so that's what I've been exploring this week, and just have a few little observations as it relates to the Asian American experience of racism in the queer community. So one, the stories of queer Asian Americans are really largely unexamined. It's a really fast growing population in the United States, but it actually still is only about 5.6% of the actual population. And so Asian Americans are often really overlooked in terms of everything from political discourse, media representation, and also, of course, queer discourse. And on a personal level, that really resonates. You know, growing up, I loved Margaret Cho, a big comedian, this was just a queer Asian woman who had the audacity to be funny on stage. And then kind of zooming forward now the past couple years, we have, The Half of It, or we have Tan France from Queer Eye, Cousin Oliver from Crazy Rich Asians, still kind of only a certain number that I can really count on two hands, but it's very clear that we need investment in research to see what kinds of programs and policies are needed for Asian Americans. Second, and this is something that's already been touched upon, queer spaces are white spaces to me. They have been since I grew up in Kentucky, and different GSAs in high schools, to when probably my first experience of queer community was at school at Yale. I graduated a few years back, and it was mostly white. And I think for me, I just wasn't interested in being othered in an already othered space. And I think one thing that happens, and I think Roslyn, you touched on this a little bit, I think white queers can sort of attempt to excuse their racism and xenophobia by claiming minority status. And this really affords them the ability to have access to power and privilege through the replication of those normative Western white supremacist ideals. And this includes everything from casual racism, like no Asians on dating apps, to choosing to ignore, this is what we've been talking about, ignoring just advocating for rights for queer people, which includes healthcare, housing, et cetera. And I also, to be clear, Asians are very complicit in this, as sometimes seen as approximate to whiteness. So Asians are very complicit in that as well. And so I think it's very clear to me that queer spaces just exist to have a responsibility to ally themselves with other queer, Black, Indigenous, people of color folks, and use their platform and privilege to elevate those issues. And then the last couple of things is something I want to elevate is just about the friction of choosing between identities. So like many children of immigrants, queer Asian Americans often have to contend with their families and cultural traditions against embracing of their identities. And specifically with Asian Americans, there's this concept called filial piety, which maybe you all are familiar with, which is basically this feeling that you have to do good by your parents and ancestors. And that really is tough in reconciling with your queer identity. I know personally for me, in reckoning with my family, it was less about disgust, but it was more about, for myself, but it's more about shame of how my queerness would be a risk to my mom's and her grandparents' sacrifices to coming here and being able to gain an education. And so, one last note on that is like white queers might ask, why bother with your parents? Like, why is there this dependence? And I think, many immigrants rely on their American-born children for translation at a very young age, and there's that mutual independence. You can't walk away from that, and the queer community right now and culture doesn't account for that. And then lastly, I just want to make one last note on elders. So for me, I've learned so much from coaches and role models throughout my life, and I've never in my life seen an older queer Asian person, let alone one in a couple. And, I've never seen a queer Asian person like getting old with a partner and dying with a partner. I don't have many models of that. And I think that's what I want to be. That's why I push myself to be on this panel. I want to be that queer Asian lady, queer old Asian lady for others. I want to be able to model queer Asians in healthy relationships, being invested in their communities, being involved politically, and just being in love. And so that's why it's important to me when I speak to students, especially if there are Asians in the Asians in the audience, to always out myself, because I know that's really important.
Thank you, Caroline. And finally, Karleigh, we're going to go to you.
Thank you, Patrick, and thanks for allowing me to be a part of this. And honestly, I was very nervous getting up this morning knowing this panel was coming, because I wasn't sure what I was going to say. I had no idea what was going to come out of my mouth, or at first, even if I had anything to contribute. then I went running this morning. And that's when I started thinking about what this community means to me. And I'm going to say up front, tea will get spilled today by me. And I want all those, especially all my white queer folks, I want you to know, not coming from a place of hostility, but actually coming from a place of love and defense for our community. And why do I say that? Because it's this queer community in particular, which for the first time in my life gave me a place to find myself. And I'm talking about communities such as New Haven Pride Center, which was one of the first lifelines. I'm also talking about a lot of good people who at the beginning of my own journey at the intersections of being Black, being trans, and being queer, who helped me find my way and embraced me and opened their arms to me when they didn't know me from a can of paint. It's those sorts of things that lead me to speak out. And there's a lot to speak out about, because I grew up as a Black child in Ronald Reagan's America. I grew up in Nebraska, one of the most conservative states in our union. I have seen it. I've seen anti-Blackness from that perspective. I've seen anti-Blackness from the queer perspective, but and you have to fight against that. And that's a struggle within itself. But I also have the additional struggle of struggling with anti-gayness within my own community, anti-queerness within my own community, and anti-transness within my own community, in addition to the systemic anti-queerness, anti-Blackness, and anti-transness that we see in our society. What you're seeing in many ways is a symptom. These are symptoms. Homophobia is a symptom, transphobia is a symptom, queerphobia is a symptom. All these things are symptoms. These are systems that in play. And as long as we engage in discriminatory practice within ourselves, all we do is strengthen these systems. So yes, we're going to talk about anti-racism. We are going to tell some truth today, but this truth is being told from the standpoint of defending our community so we can best defend and fight for our community. Because to me, this community has given me so much. It's given me a place to be socially. It's given me such nourishment that in a lot of my life I really haven't had before, and such comradely fellowship that I haven't had before. It's given me a place to give a political voice. So this conversation is not about offense. This is about community self-defense. So let this conversation begin.
Thank you, Karleigh. That was I'm sitting here for clips because that was such a good get us going here. And I'm going to start using community defense. I'm stealing that phrase. So I want to bring us back to where we started with Roslyn with the prompt, because I think that was a good start. And I'm going to really open the floor and take up very little space as possible. So I'm going to bring us back to that prompt, if everybody's okay with that. And just to kind of reiterate what that prompt was, it was, when you think about racism in the queer community, what is your response? What triggers does it bring to the surface? That's where we're trying to go today. So I'm gonna throw that out as a continued prompt as we continue the conversation. And we're gonna also popcorn this so anybody can jump in.
If I could jump in just based off of what Karleigh just said, when I hear, like, when you said community defense, I'm having a lot of feelings, y'all. Like, we only like 15 minutes into this and I'm already feeling feelings. But something that I was just thinking about, and I had this conversation with someone else about the concept of love arguing. And I was just thinking about the idea of when you try to call out and or call in someone with regards to their problematisms, which is not a word, but we're gonna make it a word today. It's the reaction is defensiveness, right? Like, no, like I didn't mean that. My intentions, and no look on impact. And I'm just thinking about with regards to racism, it's also bringing me to a place of whiteness and how like whiteness deals in binaries, right? And that affects our understanding of gender, it understands our understanding of sexuality, but it also it underpins our understandings of our interactions with one another and how we relate to one another. And I think about the ways in which brown and black people have figured out or are innately equipped with this idea of, I can call you in and out and know that that is always coming from a place of love because I'm holding you accountable to our relationship. And so it's very interesting to see how whiteness will show up in the cultural norms of queer spaces, where the first initial response to someone telling you how you can be better for them in this relationship between you is, no, I'm being attacked. And I just wanted to name that out loud because I'm also thinking, like, in hearing a lot of the comments so far, we're obviously focusing a lot on culture, right? Like queer culture, what does that mean? And how does it need to be shaken up and dismantled because it's so rooted and aligned with whiteness? And there's just so much that there's so much that this community has to learn from the ways in which brown and black people have learned to navigate very difficult, complex, nuanced emotions. And the other thing that I'm thinking about is I read a tweet, I think like 2 weeks ago, which I thought was brilliant, and I'm going to do a terrible job paraphrasing it. But basically, it was just honing in on the fact that very often when we talk about intersectionality, one, it's always used improperly. It's always like used synonymously with like diversity or like inclusion or whatever, like things that it doesn't mean. But the other thing that what happens in those conversations about intersectionality is that it's always seen as if the norm or the default reality for most folks is white, and then everything else is just an added layer to it, which still centers whiteness, as if like your reality is the norm, and it's not. Like, it's just not. And so brown and black stories, or stories that are often the most marginalized, are the core stories. Everything else that you're experiencing with regard or not experiencing because of whiteness being in the protection, and I benefit from that as well, speaking as someone who's a white Puerto Rican, right? Like, my reality is not the default reality for the queer community, and that needs to be said over and over again and reminded over and over again until that is the default understanding of how we navigate conversations of this work, and how we show up for it. So that's all. I'll stop there.
And I just want to build on Roslyn. You said, you know, white folks from the larger dominant LGBTQ plus community need to learn Black and brown stories and where we come from. And they also need to know just basic Black American history. So one thing that has always driven me just up the wall is when we're discussing race, class, and culture, how this automatically turns into this thing about the color of my skin. And we're not talking about the color of my skin. We're talking about my culture and my beliefs and what I hold dear. So when I talk about yesterday, how it was Black and queer and Afrocentric, everyone knows Ephraim. He's a DJ who does all of his great club stuff. Yesterday, he was a DJ doing what he was doing at the Black Lives Matter rally. And he ended it with, we ended it with a Vogue battle. And that Vogue battle started with a class where Ephraim taught a bunch of little children how to duck walk. And that's Afrocentric culture like no one's business. It's centering us, it's coming in, we're putting our children first, we're giving them some of our history, and we're including them in our larger world. So yes, the big folks are gonna do their voguing in a little while, and they're just gonna be out there in amazing ways, but we start with our children. And I found in many of these places, like, racism rears its ugly head because of ignorance and people don't understand. So my trigger, like, for real, one of my biggest triggers is anyone who, when they wanna talk about equal or equitable marriage. Because my first issue with that was with two beautiful little Smith undergrads who were white girls who'd set up their table outside of the grotto in Northampton, and I was a poor young Black single lesbian mother. And my sister was also a young Black mother, and I had a job with benefits and she didn't. And many people in the state have heard this whole story because I've been saying it since 1993. But these women had their talking points about how important marriage was. And I was here just trying to be a bit expansive, like, look, there's no woman I want to be married to forever, but I've got this sister, and all of this stuff that you're talking about, like all of these rights and responsibilities and ways that we can like build wealth together is wonderful if my sister and I can do this. And, you know, they just kept giving me, I was like, look, I'm Black. I don't think you understand. Marriage doesn't do all that stuff. From my cultural perspective, and also my mother's white, so we were not allowed to be married. So this wonderful argument that you're throwing at me is the wrong argument. And then over years, I got to hear about this homophobia because Black people were so against this gay marriage thing, right? And it wasn't that, it was just tone deaf people brought the wrong argument to people who said, well, you want something that I don't have access to. And it was just this tone deaf ignorance being run by white supremacy that said, I'm not even going to examine my approach. I'm not going to examine my words because the words that I used didn't work for you. You must hate people like me.
Yeah, I mean, so two things. One thing, Kamora, you just said about sort of the marriage equality, right? And I think one of the, if we're looking at maybe a more holistic way of intersectionality, right, is that for our queer folks of color who are also living with disabilities, there still isn't a marriage equality movement, right? Because the way our healthcare system and our government is set up, if you have a lifelong chronic condition, right, and you were to get married, the obligation of those medical expenses move to your spouse, which means that marriage equality is still not possible for folks who are just existing, right? So there's this insidious ableism that comes up with marriage equality, right? Because it still has always been about wealthy white gays wanting the rights that wealthy straight people have, right? It has never been about equality. It's never been about any sense of anything. It's so fraught with loopholes, because the fact that the Human Rights Campaign still exists and has not redirected their enormous wealth, right, to support folks of color, to support folks living with disabilities, right, shows that the movement was not about equality, right? It was about making sure that white gay guys could get married the way they've always wanted to, right?
We saw that last week when we just had this major Supreme Court victory that I think for any of us really looking at it was much bigger than marriage. Like, I can have a job and support myself versus I can get a tax break and not pay taxes because I'm legally embedded with this person. And
Yeah.
Celebrations. I mean, this is true. So we've got that. But I didn't see gay mainstream America celebrate as loudly as they could have if marriage were not that rich, privileged white fight that we tried so hard to pretend as if it wasn't.
Yep, absolutely. And, so it's ridiculous. I mean, it truly is ridiculous the way, like Roslyn, you were saying, those mainstream narratives, right, become so like engulfing within what we're trying to do. And something I just want to go back to clarify about why, like, I position being Lebanese as being white. For some context for folks who are not really maybe intimately familiar with the history of the Middle East, is that is a categorization that has been given to us, right? Because of Lebanon's strategic positioning on the Mediterranean as the gateway to the Middle East, it has been positioned as white to remain that the US's interests can stay in the Middle East, right? Like, our whiteness is lent to us until a time comes where Lebanon is able to, and many people in Lebanon still work against its own colonizing oppressions, right, from the French and from the US, right? But there's a whole global context of why Lebanese people are white, right, but Syrians are not. And there's a global interplay that I just wanted to clarify, because I'm just to make that point come across clear. And I will stop talking now.
I'm really happy that y'all are bringing all of this, because that's actually kind of like my response to that prompt. My issues come from just the mainstream narrative being so focused about, okay, what can a queer cannot do right now that a straight can? And how am I gonna fight for that, but only that, without really listening, what are the needs of my community? And yes, like, I mean, marriage is great, whatever. In the US, still 50% of marriages fall apart. So I would hardly consider it a huge win. And Kamora, you said it beautifully. I would say that the Supreme Court decision from last week would be a much greater victory. With that being said, why is the narrative not shifting? Where is that call for equality and equity and liberation? It's being co-opted by white interests. And I think that one of the main examples that just gets my blood boiling is the thought that if something, and I remember, like, the first example that is coming to my head right now is a case of, like, two white lesbian women in the UK that got assaulted in a bus or something like that. And it just went viral and everybody was, you know, all the queers were talking about it. It was rainbow flags everywhere and like homophobia is wrong. Homophobia is, you know, the death of it, right? Because it was two white lesbians in the UK. We don't even know the number of LGBTQ folks currently sitting in detention centers in the US that are escaping not just systemic violence by the state, but just any sort of economic violence, any sort of like all these other types of violences, and they're coming to the US and re-traumatized. And they're being met with violence paid by us. But we don't see that. And thank you, Bilal, for bringing out the Human Rights Campaign, because where are they in this conversation? Where are those conversations about human rights when we know that they're, you know, in bed with Democrats, and it is Democrats that militarized our borders. It is Democrats and the Obama administration that allowed for Trump's deportation machine to be oiled and running and ready to go at industrial proportions. Where are they in these conversations? Where are they in the conversation for Roxana Hernandez, who was the first, I don't want to say it's the first case, but it's the first case in the last couple of years that kind of went viral, and to a degree, of a trans woman dying while in ICE custody. I'm not going to say that it was the first case, because to be honest, we probably don't even know who was the first case. But this was a trans woman from, God, I don't remember if she's from Honduras or El Salvador, from Central America, who was running away from violence. She was HIV positive, and she was physically abused while in detention, denied from her meds, and ultimately died because of AIDS complications while in US custody. Where is the Human Rights Campaign in that conversation? Where are all the gays in that conversation? Where are all these gay queer organizations intervening? And that is one of the first frustrations that like really get to me, is the inaction of the queer community at issues that are not white. If it was Trump's decision to like start working again, you know, for reversing the marriage decision, we would see queers organizing ASAP. We would see them on the streets by the thousands, and we would see a huge turn up. But when it is Black and brown bodies being killed, being tortured at the expense of the state, we're being met by silence. We're calling for solidarity. We're calling for help. We're calling for, you know, people to show up, and we're being met with silence. And in this day and age, I think that's something beautiful that the Black Lives Matter movement has brought up, is this notion that if a person is being silent, they're being complicit, and silence is violence. And that is something that we are going to be translating into a lot of other movements, because it is true. It is that same kind of silence that becomes lethal and mortal for our communities. And thank you so much for both of you, and for, I mean, Roslyn, you too, for bringing it up, because it's all intertwined about what is really wrong with the way in which our community, like the queer community, is really advocating for queer folks, and who's being left behind, and whose struggle is actually, or whose interests are actually being at the forefront, and who's, you know, yeah, I'll shut up now.
It's interesting, that last sentence that you said, Jesus, because when I think of this particular question, I think of something I hate. It's a term called respectability politics. I am not a fan. I've never been a fan, because respectability politics will not save you. Honestly, when I see things such as the Human Rights Campaign, yes, I went there. The Human Rights Campaign, even though it's ran by a Black guy, I still see it as the Human Rights Campaign. They say they've turned a different leaf. They'll see, but I've seen some things. I've had some things in my own personal experience. I have had a prominent leader in the trans community make fun of one of my names. A lot of people know me coming out through my process. I went by Chardonnay, and still like it, still part of my legal name, love it, but I'll admit, did take because I'm also going into more freelancing, going into business, I took a quote unquote more government, okay, we'll say it, white name. And notice how people's attitudes changed toward me when they started hearing that other name, hearing me go by Karleigh more. Certain people's attitudes changed. This one particular person's attitudes changed. Now, I'm not going to put them on blast, but I'm just going to let them know. At another level, what I see, especially in white queer spaces, and what I see especially at Pride, and this is what bothers me about this beautiful month. This month was a fight back, but I have a problem when a Pride is sponsored by a defense contractor. I have a problem when a Pride is sponsored by an energy company that promotes fracking. You see, a lot of Fortune 500 companies ride this rainbow, but we all know what color they're really about. And that has a direct knock-on effect on my community specifically. And I'm not just talking about my Black queer community or brown queer community, but but in a sense, my queer community as a whole. Do these places really have our community's best interest at heart across the board? We had this great decision in civil rights. And this shouldn't have been the time to say, hey, that's great. It should have been time to say, okay, this is nice. Now let's put this into practice. Let's go toward these companies and go toward these businesses and go towards lending institutions and say, how are you best affecting equity within your firm? How are you best affecting equity within your school district? How are you best affecting equity in your lending institutions, especially at this time of the COVID crisis, when so many places of interest within our community are at risk because of the economic fallout from this? At another level, just also want to quickly touch on what Jesus was talking about. Sitting maybe an hour away from me are a group of young trans asylum seekers. They're being administered to by a great group of people I've gotten to know. Some of them are really close friends to me up in Northampton, Massachusetts, in the Pioneer Valley. They've been doing a Herculean task of helping these young people. And I think our greater queer community, especially our greater trans community, needs to be more involved. And we also need to be involved from asking the critical question. When Jesus is talking about people at the borders, where are they coming from? They're largely coming from Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala. Now, let's go back to who's sponsoring some prides. Defense contractors. Those defense contractors and American imperialism are complicit in what you're seeing on our southern borders from their actions in Central America. Our queer nation needs to be marching on that with even greater intensity, because we understand those same, here's some intersectionality for your ass. Those same processes and those same policymakers that are going into Guatemala and El Salvador and Honduras and raising all kinds of havoc in those societies in the name of American imperialism and American fruit companies are the same people that have the Secretary of Education coming to our state saying, since you want to do right by trans kids in your schools, I'm going to hold a gun to your head and threaten the funding to your schools. Also, another minor point. 2 African-American transgender youth in our state were directly targeted and demeaned by these same K Street character assassins and by the Connecticut Republican Party. I haven't heard too much of the major queer leadership in this state speaking on that. And I think that's not a good look, folks. It's not.
Now, Karleigh, I just want to ask you about those 2 young women. And just from your perspective, do you feel that they would have gotten more support if they were white? Recently, something happened with a Black queer man in the state. And so KCC, we've got our core staff, and it was pulling everyone together saying, hey, if we have to, we are going to do what we have to do to defend this person. And it's going to make us incredibly unpopular with white gay America, but an egregious act just happened on a white gay man in this community, and we know the white gay community is not going to support him, and the larger Black community isn't going to support him. So if us Black queers don't show up for ourselves, we understand that no one will. People might say, well, that wasn't really okay, but really what we need to consider is, and there's always a way to explain away extreme racism. So these two young women, my personal perspective, if they were cute little white trans girls, the larger community would have come out to support them more.
I can't disagree with you on that, Kamora, but the bigger question is beyond that, It's beyond, to me, I'm gonna be honest with you. I have a one-word answer to that, and I don't mean it to be derogatory, but duh. We know that that's going to happen. We know how that's gonna go down. A similar case is about to go up toward the courts in Idaho, where the face of the challenge to HB 500, which is essentially a ban on transgender female participation in interscholastic and intercollegiate athletics, the face of that is largely white and cisnormative. So you know that's going to go down different. But the bigger thing we have to realize is that blowback you think you can ignore is going to be used as a knife at your own throat. The people who are using these issues, be it immigration, be it trans kids in schools, be it the attempt to return to sodomy laws. They're talking about bringing back Section 28 in the UK right now. All these groups in the United States, like the Alliance Defending Freedom, read their position papers. They're playing the long game to where they want to roll back all those rights, put them right back on the table. The way they do it is find a low-hanging fruit, find something that even white queer communities will get behind and support us. So then, while they're looking at this, we're going to gut their rights away, and they're going to thank us for it. That's the bigger issue we have to again, we have to stop looking at this as the disease and look at it for what it is. All these things are symptoms. There are systemic reasons why there isn't. I'm gonna put it out there. I'm gonna bring the hammer and sickle here today as a member of the PSL. Capitalism. That's what this is about. That's one of the reasons why you have financial institutions that will redline gay communities at the drop of a hat, but they have a floated pride. I'm sorry, I have a problem with that. I don't want big redlining gentrifying bank having a big rainbow flag and thinking everything's okay. It's not cool.
One quick thing I'd love to add to this really rich discussion to answer that prompt of something that triggers me is this concept that's been talked about, that as we've been talking about, is just about complacency, and that's something that I'd mentioned a little bit earlier. And again, just speaking to Asians, I watch Asians, including queer Asians, just really benefit off of being close to whiteness, and Asians can be seen as palatable, which can kind of lean towards being fetishized at times, but also sort of a sense of like fulfilling like a palatable diversity. And I'm especially sensitive about that, sort of being in the nonprofit space where conversations around who gets funding, who gets resources, and why are really relevant and critical and have real implications. And it's just so sad to watch. And it's sad to see it in myself sometimes. And I think my real call for queer Asians, I think there may be some on this call, is just for self-reflection and looking inwards on the way that white supremacy, which can be so slippery and so insidious, just really limits Asians' capacity to actually show up as real allies and be led by especially Black queer women who are leading a lot of the movements. And I also feel like there's room for a lot of self-reflection on how Asians need to recognize that this privilege and proximity is really conditional. Because we've seen that with COVID-19, right? With our president calling it Kung Flu, with Asians being, the Mulan poster being ripped apart, with Asians being spat on and stabbed in subways. It is absolutely conditional on a sense of privacy and a sense of peace and palatability, and that can change really, really fast. And so now is the time to reflect it and be led by others.
Yeah, I think you said a key word that for me, right, always makes me think, and you called it palatable, right? And that always brings to me like this image of like digestion, right? Something that could be easily swallowed. And when I think about Karleigh, like what you're talking about, this interplay of capital and pride floats and these sorts of things. And I think back to the Supreme Court case, like Kamora was saying, like this is about employment, right? Access to employment. This is about wealth. This is about income, right? And it reminds me a lot of like the ways when we start to look at social justice movements toward poverty, right? And removing poverty, those conversations get shut down really fast, right? And that's the fact that now there's a federal law that makes it harder, right? That's obviously it's not like this didn't cure anything in the same way that the marriage equality ruling didn't cure anything else, right? Like we could still be fired and it's still the obligation to prove discrimination, right, is on the discriminated. And I think when you think about the ways in which we are palatable toward capitalism, right, it's the same reason that the white affluent gay community, they're the ones who are being targeted in advertising, right? They're the ones who are keeping those defense contractors in a favorable position so that they keep funding Pride, because no one's looking at the folks on this call as their target community, right? Like they, quite frankly, don't care. We're not their interest. We're not seen as being have any kind of spending power, right? And that's all like a problem when you position ourselves within a capitalist structure, right? But looking over the past couple of months, there's also a huge amount of mutual aid and support coming out of the queer community that is being entirely unmatched by white affluent gay people who have just moved to their vacation homes and their Fairfield County homes and their, you know, whatever, to avoid being around other people, right? And we, from not being able to do that, have been able to create systems of support for each other in a multitude of ways that work around that sort of capitalist palatability, right? That literal eating of our own culture.
Something I'm thinking about based off of what Bilal just said and something that Kamora mentioned earlier. And I feel like this might be possibly too simple of a point because I think Karleigh just brought all the business, bringing in that not even just intersectional, but international lens. I'm honestly just thinking about this phrase of like having an inner Black woman that we hear from white gay men so often. And I'm just thinking about how it is so incredibly violent. And I had to pause because I was going to cuss for a second. I don't know if I can cuss on this platform.
You can, you're fine.
Oh, bet. So it's so fucking incredible to hear that phrase of, again, specifically from white gay men saying, oh, it's just my inner Black woman that's the third. And yet Black women are out here being completely violated. And there's no word for that. There's no phrase for that. There is no uproar about that from those same people that get their entire aesthetic and way of being by mocking and mimicking Black women. And I think that that's fucking hilarious. And I mean that, and not in the actual traditional definition of hilarious. And the other thing and this potentially might be platform to say this, but you cut me off as this. I'm also thinking about the way in which trauma porn is like literally a circle jerk for white elites, like white gay elites, and they adopt, whether actually or just, you know, within their own circles, they adopt these brown and Black queer kids who are potentially coming from vulnerable spaces and get literally mentally, physically, whatever, getting off on the trauma that is associated with their narratives and not thinking or batting an eye to it. And it's just a way for them to make money. So I'm so glad that Karleigh brought the capitalism conversation and brought the economic conversation into it, because at the end of the day, folks is trying to make money. Like white queer elites make money off of brown and Black people's death, period.
Yes. Yeah.
Period. There's no way around that.
Yeah. Those fundraisers over our death. Yeah. They love those. But you hit, like, talking about those triggers, you hit me like, is it violent? Yes. And I'm just going to go to something that's a little bit funny. There's nothing worse than being at one of those fancy gay fundraiser things, right? And watching white gay men who know how to speak standard English, have wonderful conversations with everyone else in the room. And then they get to me, it's like, oh, girl, can you just imagine? We still hit, like, dude, do you really think standing next to me and talking out the side of your mouth using your fake Black girl accent is going to create a place where I feel any kind of affinity towards you? I understand, and you also, I watched you have like real conversations about real topics with other people in the room. And then you came over here to gossip about people. And the voice that you use to gossip, to talk about other people, is your Black lady voice. What are you actually trying to say right now? And there's just this incredible place of disrespect and racism. And it's a weird thing where I've learned that when I speak to white gay folks about that and say that it's disrespectful, they still want me to accept it and understand that it's their way of like trying to honor me in some strange way. But when I say racism, this extreme defense thing happens. And so going back to those missed opportunities, Black women in this country are goddesses, period, across the board. Black women on this earth are goddesses. And when you know the history of what we've gone through on this earth, I am not exaggerating, we are goddesses. And we've got a very truth, and we've got a strength. We've got an inner strength that is amazing and wonderful, but that inner strength comes from generation after generation of a lifetime of being abused, right? And so we develop these ways of caring for us. So how many photos from the civil rights movement that people love? And I'm looking at them like, there's someone, she's got a cigarette and she's pushing someone away, but all these ways where Black women really have made it clear, we don't care, we're not dealing with this. Now, and for some folks who are here, this is not a leap. Make yourself a 12-year-old little white boy who's just realized that there's a difference in you. And the world has been created to tell you that you're better than everyone else. Everything is created to tell you that you're better than everyone else. And then you realize that you're gay. And so there's something that has thrown you to the bottom of the barrel. So first off, no one without support, no one is ever going to be able to say, you know what, I thought about myself like this, but now I've got to think about myself like this, and I'm cool with it, right? Everyone's got to figure out a way to get out of that. Without support, our beautiful little white gay baby boys turn into racist men because we didn't help them navigate what that was. They find us, we are the goddesses that they need. And then they go assigning pieces of us to them in a very irresponsible way, which creates this place where what could have been a wonderful understanding of we are not the same, we have similarities, and I draw strength from you. And I respect and honor your tradition so much that I see you as outside, but I admire you, right? Because we don't do that, and because we live in such a white supremacist, racist society, those little white gay boys are allowed to grow into the most scary and insidious racists who will smile in your face and say, oh, I'm not racist, I admire Black women. No, you don't. You admire a caricature that you continue to try to assign to me. And because I will not care for you and love you in all of your racist fantasies in the way that you need me to, I am the outlier and you need to hate me. But guess what? As you come in contact with Black women, you realize, you can't say it out loud, but you hate all of the Black women who you run into because we are not the mammy that you created in your head when you were 12 and realized that you needed someone. That's a nutshell.
If I could just quickly jump right back into that with, this is true across the board when it comes to white folks and whiteness, when it comes to culture, it's lazy. The reason why you're out here, not just your internalized anti-Blackness, but the fact that white folks are so distanced from their own history and from their own cultures before they were white, like they have no imagination and no demonstrated effort in wanting to get to know who they actually are. So they take and co-opt other people's shit because it's easier, because I can copy and paste that shit rather than doing the hard work of realizing, holy shit, generations of erasure have happened to me as well, and I don't know who I am, so let me just copy someone else's personality, their ways of being. And that shit is fucked up, and I'm so glad that you told me that I could cuss because I'm mad. So I'm gonna stop just on that point.
But a lot of that goes also back to miseducation. And that's a great deal of it. Because one thing about our society is that, especially white Americans have been taught the American myth and they bought it. And we really need to understand that this miseducation goes really deep for all of us, and we've all been infected by it. But in a queer context, the miseducation has come in terms of the fact that there's been no education. Queer history is not taught. I mean, it's not taught to any of us, especially those of us who come into our truth, who need to know what that greater history is. And those of us who have been fortunate to get a little bit of queer history, we get the quote unquote white sanitized queer history. We don't get the history of the colonization of gender and how this was colonized and part of this experiment of conquest in the New World. I mean,
Yes.
I will fully admit that is something I've recently received scholarship about, and I'll tell you, blew my mind getting all this information. I mean, and if it blew my mind getting all this information, knowing and understanding the ways in society I've been miseducated. One thing, and to anyone out there who may be thinking, oh, when did you realize, who say, oh, when you were a child, you couldn't understand racism. The average African-American child understands the racism of this country about age 7. Let's just be real about that. If you don't think so, think again. Believe me, children, Black and brown children, understand at a very young age what is happening to them. But I digress. Back to the main thing. There is so much miseducation, and in the case of queer folks, it's non-education. And unfortunately, a number of LGBTQ plus organizations that are white ran, for the most part, have been complicit in this. They've been complicit in, until recently, of opening the door even at the beginning of just acknowledging that we are because Marcia and Sylvia were. We are because Revels Caton, a great African-American, openly gay AF labor organizer in the 40s and 50s was. We are because the Harlem Renaissance was. We are because Bayard Rustin was. And we are so much a Bayard Rustin, we still run his playbook 60 years later. That miseducation has to be dealt with at the beginning before we can even take the concrete steps forward.
Yeah, and yeah, all of that. And that's where white supremacy has gotten in and just screwed us over completely. Like you talk about the Harlem Renaissance and everyone like nods their head because, okay, I've heard of James Baldwin and I've maybe heard of Bessie Smith and that's all cute, whatever. Study it. So first off, your homophobia in the Black community, thank you so much for giving us that. Thank you, because we didn't have it until white America told us that that's who we were supposed to be. And I love to use Moms Mabley. So if you've never heard of Moms Mabley, shame on you. If you have heard of Moms Mabley, I'm going to ask you to go and learn from newspaper clippings, go find old videos of this person performing, go get firsthand accounts of what they did when they were off stage and how they supported a whole bunch of person. Moms Mabley was a man. Moms Mabley knew exactly who they were, and everyone who worked with that person knew exactly who they were. The shtick that everyone could get with and everyone was comfortable with is an ignorant old Black lady who tells jokes and doesn't even try to tell jokes. She just talks about her life and she's so ignorant, it's hilarious. That human being was known and respected as the man they were. And they were also Moms Mabley. And the fun thing was when people made concessions for that person's gender, it's when white folks were around. White folks couldn't understand someone with a woman's body who dressed up like, her Moms Mabley drag is ridiculous, but who dressed up as this old lady and would shuffle out on stage. And she did end up finding some mainstream. So I think she was on Johnny Carson, some other mainstream shows. So she ended up being someone who white America knew. But to understand, again, culturally, to understand how the Black community looks at gender, sees gender, experiences difference, because out of all one, it looks much different. Everyone wants to talk about Bessie Smith. Everyone wants to talk about Baird. Everyone wants to talk about the few who we have 3 or 4 individual stories about, but doesn't want to get to, well, wait, what the hell was Harlem like? So if Bessie really was throwing the world's best lesbian, what were they, her big old lesbian sex parties that everyone knows that those were like, you wanted to be at that party, right? Everyone knew these were happening. All of the chorus girls from the Cotton Club were there taking part in these orgies. They all had jobs. They all ended up, when the movies started happening, they were all in the movies, so they weren't being blackballed by us. What's the narrative? Why do you need to tell us a different story? Because that wasn't what the Harlem Renaissance looked like for us.
I want to like step a little bit like farther in the past, because like I think that is super related to what Kamora just like said. Homophobia stems from whiteness. Homophobia is part of whiteness, and it goes like even before Harlem. It goes to like the process of colonization. It goes back to that process of, you know, European colonizers, not immigrants, because that's the other pet peeve of mine. People like to say that, you know, everybody is an immigrant unless they were like, you know, brought as slaves or they're native to Americas, and everyone else is an immigrant. But I'm sorry, first of all, that's a whole other conversation though. Not immigrants, colonizers. When colonizers came, they brought that whiteness. We know that native cultures have had queer folks of, you know, in ways that I cannot even really fully describe, because to like also Roslyn's point, that history, and to Karleigh's point, that history has been erased. That has been, it's gone. It's gone. There's very little that we know that was left from that process. We know bits and pieces, and even that right now is stained with that same homophobia and that same transphobia that came with whiteness. I'm thinking of like the indigenous roots of, you know, people in southern Mexico, the Mushes being not women, not men, but a third gender recognized by the indigenous communities, right? And how, even though historically they were considered to be sacred people, sacred folks, right now that part of culture is still being tarnished by people's ideas on gender and on sexuality. And that, you know, evangelization that came with colonizers that demonized anyone that was not conforming to man, women, and heterosexual. So when we have these conversations about queer communities and like liberation and what is next, you know, what needs to happen in our community for the job to be done, for our community to truly be like liberated, we need to dismantle white supremacy at its very core. We need to dismantle it at every single level. And we're not gonna do that by listening to the mainstream voices that are currently very loud and that have that economic power. We're gonna have to build some serious solidarity, and we're going to have to show up for one another. And that means we're gonna have to have conversations, tough conversations with our own people. I think I've been hearing a lot about folks saying, you know what, like there's a lot of like anti-queerness in, you know, the Black community. There's a lot of anti-queerness in the immigrant community, in the Latinx immigrant community, and we're gonna have to do that work. Because at the end of the day, it is that one same monster that we're gonna have to like tackle. But yeah, I think they're just wanted to like draw that connection, because like we cannot really say that queer liberation is not gonna come from a place of whiteness. It's gonna have to come from people of color. It's gonna come from the dismantling of police brutality, and more importantly, it's not gonna be pretty. It's not gonna be loving and peaceful and full of rainbows and butterflies and all the, you know, stuff that we find at Pride. It's gonna be messy, and it's not gonna be always pretty. It can be ugly. And in the spirit of the names that were mentioned before, Sylvia Rhur and Marsha P. Johnson, it's sometimes gonna take a brick in hand and conflict to achieve it. And I just really want to make sure that we're like, us like just keeping that in mind throughout the rest of the conversation, that the issues that the quote unquote queer community is facing right now are stemmed from whiteness. Their source is whiteness, and we cannot expect whiteness to be the queer savior.
And American whiteness was created as anti-Blackness. And so this is, I heard folks earlier talking about, you know, so what is your culture before you were white? We need to understand that this country has had this agreement with every immigrant group. So I'm right there with you. So the colonizers got here first, and then there are immigrant groups that came. And every immigrant group had to, in order to be accepted as being white, they had to step into this anti-Blackness thing. And we're seeing it happening with large groups of Latinx folks. We're seeing it definitely happening with Asians. It's been happening there for a while. We're seeing it happening with Southeast Asians as well, right? And there's this need to be anti-Black. So while we all need to come together, I'm going to stay in this place of we all need to support Black people in America. This country, there's still many people believe we are the only people who are deemed 3/5 of a human in this country. So immigrant groups, I get it. Immigrant groups move into this country and they look at us and they say, I've got a store, I've got this, we put together this wonderful way to share resources, and we don't know what's wrong with you Black people. And if you don't know our history, I understand that sentiment. I understand looking at us and understanding that we must be the most lazy, ignorant people ever until you look at what this country has done to us. So if we are going to come out of this, like the truth is, this is not just because I'm a Black woman saying this. If we look at where the issues come from, if we understand that this white supremacy thing is a thing, and we understand that every immigrant group, when they got here, if they got to Ellis Island, if they got to JFK, if they got to Miami, once they got here, it was made abundantly clear, we hate Black people. You are not Black. If you align yourself with Black people, you will not have the same opportunities. If you align yourself with whiteness, even by being the cute, spicy one, the cute, whatever little thing we're gonna give you that makes you just a little bit different, as long as you can hate Black people, we're here together. And the queer community, like I heard a new one today. So people of color, they've been pushing that at us forever. It's a political term, it makes sense. Then BIPOC, I swear to God that BIPOC was created because they understand that you're not gonna get Black Americans to stand against Indigenous Americans, so it was another way to erase us. This morning I read another one. What is the discomfort with saying I love and support Black Americans? And as we're going to come out of this, you can't just keep saying, oh, we learned this from people of color and people of color. No, Black Americans built this country. We've never been, whole other conversation, we've never been compensated for it, but we are constantly being asked to jump into and support someone else's fight when it's been made abundantly clear to us that no one knows what our fight is, and they don't know what our fight is because they've got no clue what we've been through in this country. They've got this idea that enslavement happened, but they don't know our history, and you can't expect Black people to jump in and help you get yours, knowing that since 1619, that's the year we're using, knowing that we have never had any type of equal footing since then. There's a TV show called Atlanta, and there's an episode called Montague that I love to have people watch, and that episode makes it quite clear that they've got a whole bunch of Black queer people in the writing room, because there's a Black man who is not getting any respect at all, and no one's going to respect him or his music or his lyrics, and he is being forced. He's in the hot seat, he's on a CNN type news show, and he's being forced to make it clear that he supports all queer people, all queer rights, all trans rights, and no one does anything on that show to even pretend as if they understand him and his issues. You can't keep saying that we're gonna come together and erase Black people by making us people of color, BIPOC, and all that other good stuff. That is still white supremacy. White supremacy lives in gay culture when gay culture says we're all alike. Blackness.
Kamora, I'm gonna use that as an opportunity to actually pose one of the questions from our audience. And I also wanna say that I wanted to get to this before we got to the end, because we are almost at 3:30 already, because we're having such a good conversation. Juan Fonseca Tapia, who just became the new coordinator for Quest, asked the question, can we talk about LGBTQ organizations' complicity in the reproduction of white supremacy within the queer rhetoric? And so I think that's a really great question for us to explore for the last 10, 15 minutes that we have.
I would love to see queer organizations do the hard work of admitting what they did wrong loudly to the community. This is Connecticut. And I know that as I'm saying this and I'm opening my mouth, first off, I know there's a whole lot of people who are saying, ooh, what's Kamora gonna say, right? You know, we all know. And there are real Black queer people in this state who have truly been hurt. The day before yesterday, I talked to a young Black queer human who was really hurt by a queer serving organization, and no one has ever apologized to this person. And this person, I mean, people can say whatever it is that they want to do, but that person deserves an apology, and that person deserves a public apology. And I think our organizations really need to look at, do they have leadership that can accept what they've done and can accept stepping into a public role and discussing what they've done? And until that happens.
Kamora, I want to throw a little trans perspective in that to add to that. To all the mainstream organizations who are now talking about Black trans lives matter, we have to do something about Black trans women being killed. Stand with me and fight with me while I'm alive. Don't wait until I'm dead to do that. Hear me one more time for the people in the back. Fight with me while I'm here. Don't wait until I'm dead to do that. Everybody standing up. Oh, remember this name, they died. Remember that name, they died. Put that energy and intensity to the fights I'm fighting right now while I'm alive. Put that energy and intensity to that HHS ruling that's saying that a health practitioner will have the right to see me die or not give me care because my lifestyle just triggers my Christian sensibilities or whatever bullshit that they come up with. Connecticut, people here in Connecticut, you have an opportunity to ring into a trans rights fight right now. The Secretary of Miseducation, Betsy DeVos, has taken a glove and slapped you across the face with it and said, if you show fairness and humanity to transgender youth in your state, I will pull your federal funds. And Governor Lamont said, well, I don't know if I want my federal funds. No, you need to get in the face of every state legislature in the state capitol and say, no, you will stand up to this Department of Miseducation. You will tell Betsy DeVos, try it. I'll see you in court. We need boots on the ground and people in the streets. We need you mobilized for the fights ahead, be it the fight for trans rights, be it the fight against police brutality. Also, I would be remiss not saying this because this will directly affect a lot of LGBTQ people in this state. On July 1st, the rent moratorium in Connecticut ends. That's really important because that means a lot of people are going to get thrown out in the street who still cannot work or have never had work through the economic turmoil of the COVID-19 crisis. We have to do, I want everyone, you want a movement to plug into, hashtag cancel the rent. There's one you can plug into right now, and that's going to affect an awful lot of queer and straight and cis people in this state as well. We have to understand that it isn't just about queer, it isn't just queer interest. Queer rights is your fight. Trans rights is your fight, because all these issues that are hitting my community hard, hitting Roslyn's community hard, hitting Bilal's community hard, hitting Caroline's community hard, hitting Jesus's community hard, it's going to hit all of us. In fact, in many ways, that's all it is. Do you think that only trans people have to deal with wage theft? Or undocumented people deal with wage theft? We all deal with wage theft because we're all members of the working class. When you stand up for queer people, you stand up for the working class. When you stand up for trans kids in our schools, you stand up for all kids, and you stand up for the working class. I say this so often, if you don't want to get knocked on your ass, come fight for the working class. And LGBTQ rights is fighting for the working class. So if you want to, if you really want to get in and start mobilizing, working on these issues, there's plenty of ways to do it. But the biggest thing is you have to be willing to wear out the shoe leather. You have to be willing to march, and you have to be willing, if need be, shut things down. The system is the problem. You are not going to dismantle Massa's house with Massa's tools.
I think what I like to add, so I'm less familiar with these organizations, but I think I'd say the same thing to just generally nonprofits and philanthropic institutions, which is just actually give up power. Just give up power. That means funding, that means leadership, that means board seats. There's a million ways to do that, but it's actually give up power. There's this great book called Decolonizing Wealth, which maybe y'all are familiar with. I think he talks about different steps to decolonizing wealth. And I think a lot of these organizations are really quick to act, especially during, especially when they have more pressure. And I think they don't leave a lot of room for grieving and, to Kamora's point, apology. And those are the first two steps to decolonization. And then eventually in that, and then in further acts, actually giving up the power that they have.
At the same time, though, it's not just, it's not so much about giving up power. It's realize that you have more power when we share power together, and we build our power, and we build on our strengths. That's how we really that's how things get done.
Yeah.
That's the bigger issue of how things get done. I mean, again, I talk a lot about fighting for the working class. Do you know what, a good example of missed opportunity was the union movement in this country. The union movement for decades wouldn't allow black folks in the union. And then they wouldn't allow women in the union. And then they said, no, I don't know if we want those gay folks in the union. And now some union folk even say, do we really want to, we got to stand up for the, wait a minute, for the transy who's-its? We got to stand up for, I actually had a union person say that to me. We got to stand up with you transy who's-its. Do you know what happens when you stand up to us transy who's-its? You double the size of your union. That means the boss has a harder time kicking you around. So it's not just about, I mean, at one level, yes, giving up power, but more so it's building power and coming together and realize that if you want to go fast and really go nowhere, go by yourself. But if you want to go far and make systemic change, we can only do it together.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that along with that, it is important to also have these organizations do the work. And this is me coming from someone that works for one organization that has a very, very, very problematic history. So our history, as you know, Planned Parenthood has like a very, 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 I don't even want to call it a problematic history. It's like right all, it's just like there is a history of racism, and especially with our founder, Margaret Sanger, who you all know, received money from the eugenics movement back in the day. And overall, as a white-led institution, has a lot of issues happening. And it's, you know, part of it, I think, it's acknowledging that history. Part of it is going to be, as Caroline said, I mean, and I don't want people to get it confused, saying that giving up power is the same as having, as including folks in those positions. If hold on, let me elaborate on a little bit on that. It's not the same to just fill in a quota and say we have a diverse board, or we have a diverse executive team, or we have a diverse staff, than to really allocate power and put weight on where those words lie. So I think that it is true for most nonprofits that there will be, if they dig deep enough, there's gonna be some problematic history. There's gonna be issues, there's gonna be harm that has been done to communities of color, Black communities specifically. There's gonna be instances where harm was truly done. And it's having that conversation about how can we not only fix and ensure that that does not happen again, but rather how can we now also do the reparations needed to build that power? Because there cannot be power built without trust, and there cannot be trust if we cannot acknowledge that we harmed and we apologize and we try to make things right again. Those are super, super important. And I think that to answer this question is a lot of hard work. There needs to be a lot of hard work, a lot of very uncomfortable work that requires people to sit down in a room and have difficult conversations without wanting to step, you know, without like stepping out and saying like, oh no, but like, that is not me, that was, you know, someone else. It's like, okay, yes, that is the legacy that I'm carrying on right now, and we're gonna have to undo that. And this applies also on a personal level, at an organizational level, and ultimately is gonna have to apply at a national level, because those same systems work at every stage of the ladder.
I think of all of those missed opportunities, and I want to say it was maybe 2010, 2011, but at Creating Change, which is the big, huge national LGBTQ progressive conference, and it's what it is, right? And so you get everyone there. And that was the year that it was in Chicago. So if anyone wants to look back, it was the year it was in Chicago, and there's going to be a dinner that build a wider bridge. So that was a group of Israeli queer folks, and they wanted to do something. And then there's another group of Jewish queer folks who are anti-Israel. And so you had this group that was trying to create a conference that had space for everyone. And you had this place where you had these two groups that had real conflicts, and no one anticipated it before, or no one had the conversations, and then chose to address it in a way that could keep the problems from happening before it happened, right? And so then the conference happened, and then the conference, I like to say the conference ended up protesting against itself, and it was awful, and it was uncomfortable, and that last day of the conference, no one wanted to go, no one wanted to look anyone in the eye. It was an issue. And Rhea Carey, who is the white lesbian, who is the executive director of this organization, had a ballroom and went in there and stood in the front and said, "I'm sorry, and I'm here to listen to what you have to say." And then she stood there and she listened. And there were places where she did that beautiful place of, there are places where she gave explanations without making excuses. And so she shared how decisions were made and made it quite clear, like, there was a whole bunch of middle-aged white lesbians in this room. We made mistakes. This is how we made these mistakes. And I wish that everyone had taken that one conversation back to their states, rather than, we all got, it was a 3-day conference. We all got a lot out of it, but there was a white, cis, lesbian executive director who was ultimately the person who signed up on all the decisions that created places where disparity happened at this wonderful, great conference. And she chose to put herself in a position where she heard everyone's complaints. She accepted all of them. She offered explanations. And then afterwards, she sent out a letter that I felt was an actual real, like, it wasn't that whole mea culpa, I'm so sorry, I won't, like, clearly we're going to screw up again in the future. And I really wonder why white executive directors throughout this country didn't take the lessons that they got from her and then figure out how to do them in their own. So again, missed opportunity. We all could have gotten so much from that one conference, from that one conversation at that one conference.
So we just hit 3:30. So what I want to do is do a round of closing remarks from each of our experts. And I'm going to just go in the same order that I have on my screen. Yeah, I know, Ross is like, no. I'm gonna, well, fine, we'll do reverse order. We'll start with Kamora. So, just a couple of final words. And I say all this to say that as the executive director of the New Haven Pride Center, I think myself and our entire staff understand that this is just a beginning of a very long conversation that we need to continue to have as a community. And I look forward to having more of these conversations, whether they're like this over the internet or in person. And I personally want to thank all of you for being here. But Kamora, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Okay, not trying to love fest it up here, but thank you, Patrick. I appreciate you. I respect the work that you're doing. I truly respect the work that you're doing. And I respect the mindfulness that you're adding to this work. This is a conversation that has been necessary for decades. This is a conversation that has not happened yet. This is the first time I've been in Connecticut for a while, and I went to just check to make sure that I had my facts straight. This is the first time that a mainstream gay, queer organization in the state of Connecticut has chosen to address racism for real in this type of a setting. So I want to thank you so much for that. This is necessary. And guess what? We didn't joke. We didn't turn this into a sarcastic laugh fest. This was so real. I appreciate you. This conversation needs to keep happening. And I appreciate this is happening. If you hear appreciate over and over and over again, I want change. We haven't been anywhere near ready for change because people haven't been able or willing to have the conversation. Let's continue these conversations so that we can have real change. Thank you so much.
Well, now I'm blushing and I'm glad my screen is hidden. Thank you, Kamora. I have to give a shout out to Kamora's Cultural Corner and all of the amazing discussions that they have weekly. And you should all check them out. Anybody who's watching this and doesn't know the amazing organization that is Kamora's Cultural Corner in Hartford, we are proud to partner with them all the time. So I want to give you that shout out. So Jesus, on to you.
Just echoing that thank you message, because this has been an amazing conversation. I'm very, very honored to be with my fellow panelists, because I know each one of y'all personally, and I know that each one of you are amazing human beings. So I am beyond honored to have been among with you all and have this beautiful conversation. I do think that this is something that we're gonna have to continue, not only, as our individual orgs, but on a personal level. And Patrick, thank you so much for allowing us to have this conversation and to really, really dig in topics that are, it could have been easy easily just something very, very superficial, something that is like, oh yeah, you know, like that guy over there, like he hit me off in like a really weird way, and like that's my experience with racism in the queer community, but it really goes deeper than that, much deeper than that. And I'm really happy to stand in solidarity with all of you. With that being said, obviously this is the organizer in me. My request, obviously there has to be a request, because we need to keep building power, and I need people that are in this call right now, or people that are going to be watching this later on, to really get engaged. I'm not gonna really give you, I didn't come really prepared, so shame on me, but I'm gonna definitely ask you to check out different organizations that are doing some amazing work locally, because the fight is not over. Karleigh mentioned the, right now, after COVID, there's gonna be issues with rent, there's gonna be issues with evictions, there's gonna be different issues for folks happening. And we know that in terms of housing situations, the queer community is disproportionately affected, especially queer community of color. Black queer folks are disproportionately affected by housing situations. So keep an eye out, make sure that you're getting engaged with work. There's a coalition to cancel the rent that, if you all don't know, the moratorium that the state put does not cancel the rent from previous months. It just pushes the due date for that amount of money, but it all accumulates. So that is gonna be a huge issue. Black Lives Matter. The protests are, you know, they're not happening every weekend anymore. However, there's still movement being built. So please get engaged. Follow Justice for Jason. Follow the Bail Fund. Follow the Black Lives Matter in New Haven. Follow all the folks that are doing the work on the ground, and listen to their directions. Do not introduce yourselves into the movement and try to lead. Sit back, listen, follow, and together we're going to be able to create the world that we deserve. Probably will not happen in our lifetimes, but hopefully it will happen in the lifetimes of our beloved children and grandbabies. So yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you, Jesus. Karleigh, we're giving the mic to you.
That's a very dangerous and blood-curdling thing to do, Patrick. Giving the mic to me. Seriously, first, I want to thank you for giving me the space to be a part of this and giving us this space. This was an important conversation and need to be had, but it's only a beginning. And again, I say this is important because this is a part of our community self-defense. And please understand that, I mean, so many of these issues, our LGBTQ community, our queer community is at the warhead of so many things. But at the same time, take heart, even in this struggle, because understand, we've won, we're winning, but the conversations that we're having now, the difficult conversations, are going to help us win resoundingly. So we get to the point where we're not having these fights anymore. And should they come up again, we're more able to fight them. The time is right for change. People are hitting the streets. People have seen, the coronavirus crisis has seen conclusively, the center cannot hold. The dirty, soiled linens of this system are out there for the world to see now. That's one reason why you have so many people out on the streets, because they realize this system cares for none of us. And they've shown that conclusively. 120,000 Americans dead in the space of 12 weeks. That is over twice the amount of the number of Americans killed in the Vietnam War. And that took 18 years. Let that sink in. Also, like Jesus said, July 1st, cancel the rent. It's really important. It is so important that we continue. It is so important that we stand on this. July 1st, the moratorium ends. And I'm scared to think of the thousands of our neighbors, our friends in this state who potentially will be thrown out on the street in the middle of rising COVID rates. Let that sink in as well. Also, a quick note, there is a lot of power on this panel. To those who've come tonight and to those afterwards, don't let the minute go by without getting an email address, without sliding into some DMs and introducing yourself or whatever it takes. But there's so many ways and potentials to plug in the movement, and we need you plugged in. Plugging in is not getting on your Instagram. It's nice, but that's not plugging in. Plugging in is when you say, I need to be a part of this. How can I help? And notice we said, how can I help? Not how can I lead, like Jesus said, how can I help? And that's the last point of this. As you do plug in, understand that earlier this week in New Haven, a beautiful thing happened. The statue of Christopher Columbus was taken down. Very, very symbolic and very important thing. But the real statues of Christopher Columbus that we need taken down, and yes, white folks, I'm talking to you right now, are up here. That internal statue, that internal myth, your internal Christopher Columbus that's saying that this is only valid because I've discovered you, you have to dismantle it. Our survival as a queer community in particular, but also as a species in general, depends on that. That inner Christopher Columbus realized that he's lost, didn't find his way, and that myth must be dismantled up here. When we unshackle the minds, we unshackle our power, and when we unshackle our power, we can fight against this system because a better world is possible.
All right, so we had to do a quick tag in. Can we have Caroline now?
Of course. Yeah, thank you to the Pride Center. New Haven Pride was the first Pride I've ever been to in my life, and felt safe going to, and I had so much fun. So thank you for the Pride Center for all that you do. Thank you to the panelists. I learned a lot from y'all, and I'm excited for potential or continued friendship after this. Thank you to my partner Camila, who's on the call / in the next room, who really centered me in like confidence and conviction being on this panel. So we went for a couple runs together where I kind of talked it through, and so I really appreciate Camila a lot. And then my offer is, if there are queer Asians, obviously anyone I'm happy to talk to, but if there are queer Asians on this call who just want to talk about being queer, want to talk about plugging into the work that's happening in New Haven, defunding the police, etc., I would really, really be happy to talk, go for a social distance walk, go have a phone call. So I'll put my email in the chat, and I'd be happy to talk to anybody.
Thank you, Caroline. Bilal?
I obviously echo a lot of the appreciation. I'm also a firm believer in not repeating what other people have already said and had said better. So I'm gonna one of the thoughts that I've sort of been thinking about throughout this conversation is the connection between like capitalism, right, and culture, and how we've been talking about how like white folk will take the culture of other people. And one of the thoughts that I keep like turning over in my head is like, if I had a box, right, and it was filled with my culture, right, and I opened it, I feel really strongly that it would be empty because it's filled with a lot of intangible things, right? Like when I think of what my culture is, it involves both being queer and being Arab, right? It involves like, if you have company, right, like bringing like literally every single snack you have out to the table, right? Like filling it up. It involves serving the oldest person in the room first, right? It's making sure people are comfortable. It's picking people up from the airport, right? It's something, because so many folks have come to the US from my family that they needed to pick up from the airport, right? Like it's part of our culture, my culture. And I think that when I see like this Christopher Columbus statue debate, like there are petitions like keep Christopher Columbus statues up. And I almost feel like a sadness, right? That like Italian Americans have so little in way of culture that like these statues that they've never looked at or did anything for are like the center folk of their whole cultural identity. It's like, that's what you have? You have all this access to like history and your own stuff, and this is the hill you want to die on? And it really is. And then I look at us, right? And I see the culture we have that is about like how we relate to one another, right? Things that you can't actually capitalize on, right? You can't go into Home Goods and buy my culture on the shelf, right? Because it hasn't been traded to whiteness, right? but you can go into any store and buy a whole cart full of things that are Italian, right? Which is literally just like wine and pasta, right? Like these things that are sold to you as part of your own culture. I guess the imaginary Italian sitting in front of me. And so that I don't know. I'm feeling a lot of weird ways about how we buy our own culture, and that's queer stuff too. Like how we, like someone in the chat box was talking about like rainbow capitalism, right? Like how why are we buying rainbow flags and not, instead of like supporting our trans siblings, right? Like what is that? Who are you doing that for, right? Like what is this propping up of identity? So I don't know. Maybe this is the second part of a conversation, right? The ways in which we defend our cultures as people of color, right? From being taken and turned into capital that white people can just buy and pretend it's theirs. That's it. That's all I'm thinking. And then again, like I said, echoing what all the appreciation and all the great things other people have said.
Thank you so much, Bilal. And we're gonna close out with Roslyn.
I had all that time and I hope that this is gonna be cute. I'll actually share a quote from one of the young people that I work with. And I have consent, which is very important. I don't want to share their words without their consent. In this conversation, these closing remarks around statues, and I love the way that Karleigh just speaks in poems all the time, right? And that statue inside your, I want to eat you, I love it. But in that conversation, I was sifting through these questions and these think thoughts that these young people that I'm working with have, because there's confusion, there's feelings, there's like, what do we do with all this information or this lack of information? And one of the things that one of my young people said, who is a young Dominican, Afro-Dominican girl, she's only 14. She said that when people are arguing against this idea of tearing down the statues, she said that, and I quote, "It's as if white people are telling us we are who we have always been, so act like you remember." That's a quote from a 14-year-old. And that, even just saying that, hits my heart it just does a lot. My body's doing something. And I say that because, one, white supremacy is everyone's issue. And two, in the exact same sentiments where Kamora talks about it's important for folks to know Black American history, it's also equally as important while doing that to understand what was the role that white people have chosen to occupy in that history. And it has been time to evolve. And so I think that I will close by saying young people are literally asking for new worlds, and we have absolutely everything we need to do that.
Thank you so much, Roslyn. And thank you again to all of our incredible speakers, experts, panelists, pick a word, who spoke today and inspired us. And I look forward to continuing this conversation and all of these conversations that need to keep happening in our community. The only way that we can really self-defend our community, to borrow from Karleigh, is to really look inside ourselves and find ways to have these spaces and create more of these spaces, and eventually eliminate spaces that don't make room for these conversations. So again, my name is Patrick. I'm from the New Haven Pride Center. If you are looking for more information about what we're doing, particularly our week of action, which ends tomorrow, you can go to newhavenpridecenter.org. Tomorrow, we're closing out the week of action with a conversation about preserving LGBTQ history and spaces. And then our final talk at 4 p.m. tomorrow about meeting the unique needs of LGBTQ youth, which will be hosted by our youth program officer, Allah. So hope to see you all, and thank you again for sharing space with us. Have a great rest of your day.